Hello everyone, my name is Harriet Cornwell and I am Head of History at Lodge Park Academy, which is based in Corby. The title of my presentation is called We Are the Champions of Knowledge Booklets. So essentially this presentation is based on a blog I wrote a couple of months ago about the implementation of knowledge booklets into our department. So we felt by implementing knowledge booklets into our department, we have been able to start to implement and unleash a whole range of Teach Like a Champion techniques into our lessons. So this essentially explains the rationale for the presentation. So to ensure that we're teaching like champions in the history department, and this essentially is the focus of the whole school as well, is I have told this blog and this presentation through songs by Queen. Now you might be sat there thinking, you're coming from this, Harriet, with your history perspective, your history as your subjects. However, lots of the techniques and ideas which are going to mention in this presentation can apply to a whole range of subjects. So essentially just don't think this is just for people who teach history. So let's make a start. So I'm going to start off talking about reflections. So reflections, sometimes they're something which people can essentially really struggle with. So I've worked with some people recently who struggle with the process of reflection. But I feel this is an essential tool or skill which should be built into the craft of the teacher. So I have been teaching for 10 years, although I quite often like to make the joke that I have been teaching since the year 1066. In reality, it has actually only been 10 years. Now, something which I like to think about and reflect on is how my teaching has changed in the last 10 years. Essentially, I find myself quite interchangeable and quite dynamic, perhaps, as a teacher, because I would honestly say that my teaching now is certainly not what it was when I first started training as a teacher. So when I was training as a teacher, and indeed my NQT and first early couple of years as a teacher, I felt that there was an unprecedented pressure to create lots of learning resources, learning materials, lots of techniques to help students learn in the lesson. So I have included just a snapshot really of some of the resources that I have created during my 10 years of teaching. So to start off with then, we have got PowerPoints including animated dancing archers. I used to have on reflection, I used to have a running competition with one of my friends as to who could make the worst history joke in a PowerPoint presentation using a cartoon or a historical source. Certainly don't do that anymore. Videos, card sorts, carousel activities. So just in case you're unaware, carousel activity is where you blue tack copious amounts of resource around the room, and you give students a grid and they fill it in and they go around and investigate and find out new pieces of information. There is also jigsaws, sources pinned up around a room, copious amounts of worksheets, knowledge organisers, key vocabulary lists, strips of paper to cut out and stick, so perhaps something like a diamond 9, lots and lots of images and maps. So that is not to say that all of the resources which you can see on your list on this presentation are indeed dubious. I believe that some of them are useful, but my concern is the impact on teacher workload and essentially the amount of time one would spend by a photocopier. So I can remember thinking one morning about the amount of times I had spent by a photocopier printing off lots and lots of resources, which are essentially sometimes for one-time use. Perhaps if you think about that carousel activity, if you have one year 8 class, then you would just use them that once. Essentially, they're all very labour intensive And I can certainly remember days where perhaps I have used perhaps 1, 2, or even 3 of those resources in a 5-lesson teaching day. So to me, the teaching craft, the profession of the teacher, has become far too complicated and far too time consuming. So these reflections led to me implementing something which has changed the dynamic and how we essentially teach in our history department. So this is where the Queen song comes in, because we have It's a Kind of Magic. So in 2019, we started to make some serious sort of changes to the department in our approach to teaching. And in 2019, I'd like to hasten to add that this resource that you can see on your screen was not used in 2019. This is something which we used quite recently. We started to introduce something called a knowledge booklet. Now, this really emerged from my frustration that I couldn't find a suitable Key Stage 3 history textbook to purchase for the department. I wanted to purchase a textbook. I know sometimes a bit of a stigma about purchasing textbooks, but I wanted to purchase a textbook which would help out the teaching of everyone in the department, and this included some non-subject specialists as well. So I wanted to get them something to support their teaching. However, I found that everything that was available didn't really suit our student needs, and I found a lot of the textbooks were written around, mainly the focus was the history of Britain as well. So when we introduced these knowledge booklets in 2019, they were almost a supplement, a bit of a bolt-on. However, this year they have really become to sort of take centre stage. They are the foundations, the core of our history lessons. So when you would be teaching one of our history lessons, essential piece of equipment that the teacher would need would be this knowledge booklet. So I'm just going to talk to you now a little bit how I have designed them and some of the refined processes of designing, which could perhaps help you if you are going to be designing your own and want to implement them into your department. So on your screen you can see an example of a knowledge booklet. So you had the front cover on the last slide, so this gives you a bit more detail as to how the knowledge booklet would actually look. So for me, the front cover is really important. So it has, as you can see on your screen, you can see it's got an image. It has got something which is called an inquiry question, so topic 6. This topic 6 is based around the inquiry question: what do the Benin plaques reveal about European and African relations? And then underneath you can see a table. So I'm now going to talk about these 3 things which form the front cover of our knowledge booklets. So first of all, I think the image is quite important because students see that image and they know that is giving them a visual representation of the book that they should be looking for. The booklet they should be looking for. So if you say to students, you need to get out your knowledge booklets, and you can put this front cover underneath the visualizer, and they can see this is the one that they should have for their history lesson which they are attending that day. So I think a core image on the front cover is really important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the inquiry question. So you might not be familiar with what an inquiry question essentially is. So inquiry question is set out to frame the learning sequence. So essentially it is something which is a bit of a puzzle, a bit of a mystery, something which is going to inspire. And we always explain to students that when we construct these booklets and when we put together the history lessons, there is a key historical question which is driving the sequence. So lesson by lesson, we continually return to this question as well. So lesson by lesson, they should be able to uncover new pieces of knowledge which will help them answer this question. And by the end of the lesson sequence, hopefully they should actually be able to answer this question. So that is, how do the Benin plaques, which have actually been a lot in the news recently, what do they reveal about European and African relations? Now, the table underneath is the individual lessons which will be taught to students. So we have found, in particular this year, students really benefit a lesson sequence which is somewhere between 5 to maximum of 8 lessons long. So we have the inquiry question, and then you would have 5 to 8 lessons which form that part. So we find anything which is essentially any longer, students tend to forget what the inquiry question is. Sometimes they lose interest. Essentially, the topic is going on for far too long. So we have kept them to this standard, anywhere between 5 to 8 lessons. So in the table, there is each individual lesson in the sequence. So we have got the front cover, and then this page here, this is actually the second part of the lesson sequence. So it's called the first encounter. So there's a box there which students could tick off that they have learned that with their teacher in the lesson. So a couple of other things about the format. So we're going to talk actually about the knowledge. So sometimes when you see booklets, there is quite a sort of trend for workbooks. So essentially these are not workbooks. They are a resource which dominates the lesson. So there's no opportunities really for students to actually write. There's not lots of space, not lots of lines for them to answer questions and things like that. So if there was a question or you're asking them to perhaps recall knowledge, then this would be displayed on a PowerPoint. So on this page here, you can see, first of all, really essential, and this is coming from quite a lot of experience, is putting page numbers at the bottom. So this can solve lots and lots of sort of organisational issues and make your lesson transitions really clear and really crisp. You can also see here that we have also included line numbers. So these are really important as well. So as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, we use quite a lot of teach like a champion techniques, and these can be really useful if you are cold calling students. So what I mean by cold calling students is you would ask the question, say the student's name, and then they would answer the question. So if students are struggling to answer the question, you can say to the student, look at line 8, third word in, just as an example. Okay. We have also used a small indent on the right-hand side. Now, it's quite small, but it's there nonetheless. And this is essentially so that students can write, they can annotate, they can add additional knowledge. If there are keywords that they perhaps don't understand, then that can go in the indentation there. So essentially it becomes like a working document for the lesson. So when I was putting together this talk, there was a special request about how I formatted these. So essentially with the lesson, with how I formatted the booklets, is obviously we've produced these on Word. This is where you will access the line numbers. We have obviously got the indentation and the page numbers as well. Now, the last thing I would strongly recommend is if you ever used line numbers, sometimes they can do all sorts of magical things, is once you have got your document completely finished, I convert it to a PDF, especially if people are accessing it on different formats. So for example, if somebody's accessing it on Google Drive, sometimes that can actually change the entire format of the Word document. So I would certainly recommend converting it to PDF. So I'm now going to show you what a knowledge booklet would look like in its entirety. So this would be the finished document. The only thing which I haven't screenshot onto the presentation is a timeline, and we have started to build those in as constantly framing where lesson sequences and where students are currently progressing chronologically through time. So that's how we have built our curriculum in our department. So you can see each page, first of all, so is packed full of knowledge. It also has lots of two-tier language. We have also used scholarship, historical sources, maps, images, and also the timeline, which you can't predominantly then see. So the images and the maps that we have included in the booklet, we have said are essential, and these would be shown at various points to students. However, the teachers are encouraged to have additional pictures on a PowerPoint. So if they wanted to aid explanations further, then there's an opportunity to present images there too. But for ease when you are teaching, having the essential pictures which you need in the booklet is really, really useful. So I'm now going to move on to the next stage of how we would then use them to found and have it as our core base of teaching in the department. This is where the champion comes in, so teaching like a champion. So I would argue with you that the knowledge booklets are essentially crucial to the championing and the continued development of the craft of a teacher. Now, in my personal opinion, the craft of teaching is something which I would certainly say I'm not the finished article, and I think it's something which you're constantly reflecting on and constantly developing your practice, regardless perhaps of how long you have been teaching. So essentially the knowledge booklet is then for class or teacher reading, and I have left this up to members of my department to decide so whether they want to use it for teacher reading or for class reading. Me personally, I do teacher reading because I think it's really important to have that teacher voice as something that students, especially when students are learning about something which is new. Now, there is a core piece of technology which I generally have fallen in love with over the last 2 years. Yes, and that is the visualizer. Now, you need to have your visualizer on while you're doing this whole teacher reading. So we're going to have a look now at how this looks in lessons and how also it would sound too. Now, we have had some students who have come into our school to be sort of teacher trainees, and the first couple of weeks, obviously, they have of observing, going to lots of different lessons. And quite recently, one student has commented to me that they saw, me teach using these teach like a champion techniques, saw me doing the whole class reading, and they were like, yeah, oh gosh, I got this nailed. It's so easy. But I would say this is where the explicit craft of the teacher develops. And if you are thinking about implementing some of the teach like a champion techniques into your lesson, my advice would be to focus on 1 or 2 to start off with, because there's a lot of teacher cognitive process which actually goes into this. So I would say this is where the art of the teacher really begins to develop, and the craft. So first of all, we are assuming that students have got their booklets in front of them. They know which one they should have because they've got the front cover, they've got the image. Great, so we're all set to go. So we would start off by saying, turn to page 5. Now, students' organisation at our school is not the best. So what we do is say, turn to page 5, and this is something which both me and my colleague do. We would say, hold up page 5 to show me that you're on the right page, and then the teacher would scan the room. Very safe in our sort of COVID teaching area that we were currently in as well, our current practice. So you can scan the room and see that everyone is exactly on the right page. Great. Now, students then put the booklet down on the desk, and then you'd say, finger, pen, ruler, highlighter on line 1. And then you can do a quick scan of the room to see that everyone has got their finger, pen, highlighter on line 1. So those are your 2 things that I would really recommend that you start with. Then the booklet is read aloud to students. Now, for me, this is where the real passion of the subject flows. Students will listen, they'll engage with the knowledge that is being read aloud to them. They'll hear 2-tier vocabulary words which perhaps aren't in their economy of words, their common day vocabulary. And this is where the position and the status of the teacher is elevated and it's uplifted. So they are delivering expert knowledge. The students are now being delivered to various historic locations. They are visiting Britain, they are visiting the kingdoms of Africa, Benin in this instance, and they're filled with stories of people, places, and objects. So that to me, the teacher here now commands the knowledge. So this is why I think it's really important for teacher reading, not just class reading. Now, this is where the craft of the teacher really begins to develop, and this is where it can become quite complicated. And sometimes I've spent hours agonising over this because I feel it's really, really important. So you've started off essentially on line 1. Now, you'd be thinking, right, well, how do I know that students have understood what I've just read to them? On line 3, how do I know that they understand that? Where do I pause? Where do I ask questions? Which are the essential bits of knowledge that I want students to learn? So where do I emphasise this when I am delivering this out loud? Do I get students to underline it? Do I get them to highlight it? What can I essentially do? So those are essentially the planning questions that you would have before the lesson. So you would have your pre-planned questions. You might even practice, I've done this, I might even practice reading a paragraph to sort of see where the best bits are to pause and to ask those questions to students to check their knowledge and their understanding of what has been delivered by the teacher so far. Now, something which I found is that I don't write all the booklets in the department. They are something which people want to contribute, then somebody else would write a booklet. So if I perhaps haven't written the booklet, I would really want to practice before the lesson, or at least think about really clearly where I'm going to be delivering this expert knowledge, because sometimes when someone else has put a booklet together, it's really difficult to see how the mechanics work. So the planned questions and familiarity with the booklet do develop obviously after you have delivered it a couple of times. Now, I feel it's really important with questions that you ask lots of them, because this is just your way of getting instant feedback from students as to what they have understood. Now, I have to admit that I do quite often not plan my questions. So this year, the target I've set myself is to plan my questions. So questions for top, questions for middle, and questions for bottom. Now, this is to stop something which I call frisbee questions from happening. So I think it's perhaps in the natural thought process of a teacher, right? So I'm teaching, I'm saying things, right, now I must ask some questions. So you happen to try and think ones off the top of your head. So I mentioned about the cognitive overload of the teacher. Now, if you're already stressed or already anxious, as I sometimes get about, you're reading this out, you're thinking about the best possible places to pause, the last thing you want to be doing is frisbeeing a question out to students in the class. So planned questions, I have got a lot better at this year, to check for student engagement. Now, before we ended up in our third lockdown and moving to online learning, we had got some whiteboards which the school provided for our students. Now, we did use these in the last couple of weeks of term, and I found these were really useful. So they can also provide instant feedback as well. So after you have delivered all the information to students, you would ask them some questions and get them to write on the whiteboard. And you can give them very clear instructions as to when you want them to show you their answer. So we say, show me your answer in 3, 2, 1, and then they would hold up the whiteboard. So really checks for engagement. Now, sometimes I do spend the whole hour, obviously we have a retrieval practice at the beginning of the lesson, so the rest of the hour, if it's me teaching it in particular, is quite often spent just reading through this, asking students lots and lots of questions, triple checking, double checking that they've understood the key points of the lesson. When I'm happy that students are really fluid in the knowledge, we would then perhaps complete the task, which is at the bottom of the document that you can see in front of you, or sometimes we complete a task from the writing revolution as well. But for me, students being able to use this knowledge securely, having confidence in that knowledge, is really a key essential part of the learning which happens in our department. So that brings us to the conclusion of my talk, really. So this is the one vision idea that we have, and everyone in the department has been really glad of the knowledge booklets, because it's taken away that kind of second guessing which happens in times of teaching and learning. So, what are we looking for in teaching and learning? So it's very clear to everyone in the team what they should be doing, how they should be using it. And obviously we have all pulled these resources together. So taking down that sort of teacher workload and all those hours spent by the photocopier as well. So the key principles of our lessons are founding on this process. So reading and explaining new knowledge to students. Now, I know that some people will be critical of this. It may seem a really rigid way of teaching, but our students absolutely love the consistency and the routine. They really, really know what to expect when they come to lessons. Now, if I think back to the beginning where I had those reflections, we started guessing some of those carousel activities, or we started showing them PowerPoints with, animated arches on. They would certainly wonder what on earth was going on, because we have been teaching in this method for some time now. They know what to expect. It removes any complications as well, so both for teacher and for student. So, and for me as well, as a head of department, it takes away any, well, can't completely remove this, but it takes away some of the inconsistency as well. So I know when students are given that booklet, they'll be taught that information which is in that booklet. They'll have access to it, and it stops some students being taught some knowledge and other students being taught different or alternative knowledge. So our curriculum and the progress of a student are moving in this one direction. So we are all, this is a phrase that our principal uses, so we're all rowing together, all moving in the same direction with that one aim, that one prize, and that one goal, and that is to learn this core and this rich knowledge in our lessons. Many thanks for listening to my presentation. If you have got any questions, my Twitter handle was on the first slide, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Many thanks for listening. Goodbye.